Hello everyone. As the short introduction suggests, this clip is to analyze the performance of New Zealand's economy. Now, why is this relevant? Historically, New Zealand's political economy is strongly synchronized with global trends. We can see that in New Zealand, both the welfare system and neoliberalism were introduced exactly at the time when global cyclical patterns suggested, in 1935 and 1984 respectively. When the economic system of the welfare state was established from 1935, New Zealand elected its first Labour government, which was initially led by Michael Joseph Savage, then by Peter Fraser. This government enacted the Social Security Act. This act and the corresponding welfare state brought about such a success after the times of the Great Depression that Labour stayed in power until 1949. The then opposition National Party had to promise to keep this act in place so that they could become electable again. Now, in 1984 the situation was different. At the dawn of neoliberalism, contrary to the reforms of the 1930s, the government that implemented the neoliberal reforms did not campaign on it. Therefore, it is questionable whether they had the mandate to redefine the New Zealand economy. However, it can be proven that they were preparing for those measures for a long time. The reforms were introduced by the fourth Labour government, which was led by David Lange, but Lange wasn't really supportive of the neoliberal agenda. This caused his downfall later on. The key actors of that time were Roger Douglas and Richard Prebble. The neoliberal agenda led to the spin-off of Labour's left wing, former Deputy Prime Minister Jim Anderton, and he established a new left-wing party, the Alliance. Meanwhile, the founding fathers of neoliberalism also felt a bit disappointed, so they established a new party, ACT, in 1993. However, between 1984 and 1993, the first 9 years of the neoliberal economic regime, neoliberalism was indeed supported by governments. However, after 1993, governments, both led by the National Party or Labour, they were rather moderate in terms of neoliberalism. And ACT, even though they had representatives in parliament and they supported national governments, they didn't have a real influence. However, after the 2023 election, ACT gained huge influence with their roughly 9% voting base. After the government was enacted in November 2023, the first 100 days included measures which tried to facilitate further neoliberal reforms to create a more flexible labor market. Now, these measures included the repeal of the Fair Pay Agreement Act, which helped employees with collective bargaining. Also, this government reinstated the 90-day trial periods. Now, during this 90-day trial, employers can fire anyone without any justification. This, of course, creates more insecure conditions for workers. And this reinstatement happened despite empirical evidence suggested that when it was in place earlier, it didn't increase employment. So the minister responsible for this measure, Brooke van Velden, didn't listen to empirical evidence. She just wanted to promote more neoliberalism. Nice. Now, the quarter ending in March 2025 ended the first full year when the new neoliberal economic settings of New Zealand's economy was in place. Therefore, it is relevant now to compare how the economy fared in this year compared to the year before. And the last building block of these neoliberal settings was the increase of the minimum wage from 1st of April 2024. The increase was announced in February 2024. At the time, inflation was known to be 4.7% annually. The minimum wage increased only by 2%. So, more flexible labor market, lower increase to the minimum wage, everything seemed to be at place for a business-friendly environment. And how did the New Zealand economy fare? Okay. Annually, the GDP decreased by 1.1%. And the government cannot blame external circumstances and insecurities for this decline, because all New Zealand's main trading partners showed GDP growth during the first quarter of 2025. In Australia it was 1.3%, in China it was 5.4%, Japan showed 1.7% growth, the United States showed 2.1%, despite the fact that based on quarter-on-quarter figures, the United States was decreasing in the first quarter. But anyway, when we compare this to the first quarter of last year, the US still showed growth. Therefore, the New Zealand economy is performing so poorly that it is shocking. Now, the biggest catastrophe occurred in the labor market. Unemployment grew from 4.4% to 5.1%. There were 2.9% less work hours per week. It was 96.3 million hours, but anyway, it's not relevant, the exact figure. What is relevant that the working hours went down. Of course, when unemployment rises, we work less hours, yeah, but the reforms targeted to increase employment, not to decrease it. And underutilization also grew from 11.2% to 12.3%. The number of weekly paid hours, not working hours, it is different because the working hours include self-employed people and contractors as well. Meanwhile, paid hours include only full-time employees. Now, the paid hours decreased by 2%. And this is also caused by cost-cutting of the government, with another element of neoliberal agenda to decrease the size of government in the economy. Well, altogether, it was not a success story at all. Here it is necessary to insert what may explain the poor performance of the economy. We need to think through that when employment conditions become increasingly precarious for workers and the minimum wage did not even cover for the inflation, what happens is then employees will try to modify their spending and they will cut spending on wherever they can, most likely on non-essential services. And it is reflected in the data. It was the arts, recreation and other services sectors which showed the largest decline during the last quarter of 2024. Besides, it is also telling that on the year-on-year comparison, goods-producing industries fell the most. Among these industries we find construction, which had a 9.3% fall. People simply cannot afford to buy homes and pay as much rent as they could before, so inventors do not buy as many rental properties either. The prospects of the New Zealand economy, the outlook is not rosy either. The second quarter data about manufacturing and services show a further decline. What does this suggest in the long run? I believe it is a sign that the neoliberal agenda will fade away. The most likely scenario is that this government, and especially the ministers of the ACT Party, Deputy Prime Minister David Seymour and Workplace Relations Minister Brooke Van Velden together, will make neoliberalism appear so despicable so that people will send it into the grave. Okay, with a bizarre joke, I can add that this is especially interesting in the case of Brooke Van Velden. She appears to be destined to generate support for euthanasia. Between 2017 and 2020, she was a parliamentary aide to David Seymour, and her main role was to generate support for a referendum on euthanasia. By the end of the clip, Miss Mittens showed up too, and she agrees. Brooke Van Velden's main historic role is to accompany neoliberalism into its final destination. Inadvertently, without her knowing it, but yeah, that's what she is doing. Is it true, Miss Mittens? Oh yeah, it is. And to be fair, it is relevant because New Zealand will show the way for other Western democracies.